Good evening. My name is Jeffrey Sussman. I'm the author of a brand new book entitled Big Apple Gangsters, The Rise and Decline of the Mob in New York. A number of people asked me how I came to write this book and what my interest is or was in the mob. And it was based on several personal experiences. The first one, when I was 13 years old, my father introduced me to an uncle of his, a man named Irving Kay, who was a bootlegger during Prohibition. And in 1935, he had been arrested for the murder of Dutch Schultz. He was indicted, but he never went to trial because somebody else actually committed the crime, a man named Charlie the Bug Workman, who did serve quite a long jail sentence for that. But that was my first encounter with someone connected to the mob, and I was fascinated by this. Next, when I was in my teen years, I worked for my father on Saturday mornings. My father owned two garment manufacturing companies, one in Queens, one in Brooklyn. And I would work for him on Saturday mornings from 9 to 1. The factory would close at 1 o'clock. And my job was fairly menial. Most of the time I was sweeping up remnants of cloth and putting them into a barrel for someone to collect. I would go around and help clean out the tables where the women who sewed garments were sitting after they left. In addition to which, I used to carry fairly heavy bolts of cloth up from the basement to the cutter's table. And one day, when I arrived at the top of the stairs from the basement, carrying probably a 50-pound bolt of cloth, I heard my father and another man yelling at one another. And my father's fists were clenched, and I didn't know what was happening. My father had been an amateur boxer as a young man, and so it seemed entirely likely that he was about to haul off and punch this other man. He told this other man to get the hell out, and the man pointed his index finger at my father with his thumb raised, and then manipulated his thumb as if he were cocking a gun, and said to my father, "We're going to get you, you son of a bitch." Well, in the car home that afternoon, I asked my father what that was all about, and he said the man that he was arguing with was a notorious gangster named Johnny Dio, who controlled a lot of illegal unions and trucking companies in the garment center. And he wanted to unionize my father's workers and get my father to use his trucking company. My father was a very good boss, and he paid his employees very well. And so they voted against unionization because they realized they would have been paid less as a member of a Teamster local. Next, my father was threatened that he had to use Johnny Dio's trucking company to deliver dresses to department stores. He kept resisting this, and about 2 weeks later, my parents took me out for dinner to celebrate my graduation from the 8th grade. And when we got home, our house had been broken into. The refrigerator in the kitchen had been overturned, and food was all over the place, on the stove, on the sink, on the walls, on the ceiling. And it wasn't until much later I realized that this was a message that my father better cooperate, or this was just the beginning. Now, my mother had a cousin who was a very interesting man. He and a brother operated an Italian grocery store in Corona, Queens during the Depression. And they took turns going to law school. They were going to St. John's Law School in Queens. And the semester that one went to school, the other one would operate the grocery store. The store, most of the customers in the store were Italian immigrants who worked in the building trades and lived pretty much paycheck to paycheck. And my mother's cousin, his brother, often lent them money, sometimes a few $1,000s as a deposit on a home in Queens. And they got involved with mobsters for one reason or another. And in the late 1950s, the brother whom my father was closer to was arrested for torching a warehouse in the Bronx. And he was arrested. His photograph appeared on the front page of a tabloid newspaper called the Daily Mirror. And my father paid his bail. The brother was disbarred as a result of that, and he became a private detective. He was very entrepreneurial and very intelligent. He operated small airports. He and his brother built shopping malls. Late in life, he went back to college and got a PhD in psychology and became a tenured professor of clinical psychology at a university on Long Island. But back in 1958, he went on behalf of my father and negotiated with Johnny Dio so that my father would get a better deal on the trucking that he had to deal with than Johnny Dio was originally offering him. Unfortunately, my father died 2 years later of cancer, and he had a partner who was very weak and had a difficult time dealing with the mob. And the mob kept getting more and more control of the business by charging exorbitant fees for trucking. Eventually, they were able to take over the factory, and they drove my father's partner out of business. They did what was called a standard mob bust out, where they would buy merchandise on credit, then manufacture garments and sell them at a steep discount without ever paying their creditors. When they could no longer buy merchandise on credit, they incinerated the factory and collected insurance money. So that was my second involvement with the mob, and that further obviously created an interest on my part. Next, in 1980, I met a man whom I became very friendly with. He was a psychologist, and his father had been a gambler, a professional gambler in New York, who controlled all the gambling for Frank Costello. His parents were divorced. His mother was Jewish and was a seamstress and lived in a modest apartment in Brooklyn, while his father was quite wealthy and lived in the penthouse of the Sherry Netherland Hotel. This friend of mine had an opportunity to go into the mob when he was young and chose not to. He had a very strong social conscience that prevented him from doing anything like that. However, he did know a lot of people in the mob through his father and other family relations, and he told me a number of stories that I found fascinating. Two of the stories he told me, which I thought were rather interesting. One day, while he was in high school, Frank Costello and his father picked him up after school in a Cadillac limousine and drove up to Saratoga, New York for the races. When they were there, my friend, as a young boy, was introduced to Meyer Lansky, who operated gambling facilities up in Saratoga. Frank Costello and this man's father gave him several $100s to bet on the races. He bet on the races and he lost all the money. He felt very guilty about that afterwards because he realized that his mother could have benefited from this money if he hadn't wasted it on gambling. The second story he told me was when he graduated from high school, he wanted to take his date to his prom date to the Copacabana, which was owned at that time by Frank Costello. He called Costello and asked if he could arrange for him to have a table there. And Costello not only arranged for him to have a table, but had the table placed right in front of the stage where Frank Sinatra was performing that night. And when my friend asked for a check at the end of the meal, he was told that there would be absolutely no charge for dinner and drinks. So those were three events in my life that elicited my interest in the mob. Now my book goes chronologically from just before Prohibition up through the early part of the 21st century. It begins with Arnold Rothstein, who allegedly fixed the 1919 World Series. Rothstein was also the first person in the United States to organize crime Prior to his advent, there had been gangs in New York, but they operated independently of one another and often fought with one another and worked on behalf of New York politicians. When Rothstein came along, he convinced his proteges, and his proteges, by the way, were the people who really ran organized crime after his death in 1928. His proteges were Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Bugsy Siegel. And he taught them how to organize crime. He said that crime should be run like a business. They could indulge in price fixing. They could eliminate interfighting with gangs. And rather than working for the politicians, they could bribe enough politicians so that the politicians would work for them. At the time, there were two mafia families in New York. One was run by a man named Joe the Boss Masseria, and the other was run by a man named Salvatore Caranzano. And these two men had very narrow views. They would not deal with anyone who wasn't from Sicily. Never mind that Frank Costello was from Calabria and somebody else was from Naples. That was no good for them. Even worse for these two bosses was that Costello and his cohorts were partners with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, two Jewish gangsters. So, in order to organize crime and have it operate on a multi-ethnic level, they felt that they had to assassinate Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. Joe the Boss Masseria was assassinated in a diner in Coney Island while having lunch with Lucky Luciano. Luciano excused himself to go to the men's room. When he did so, the four gangsters came in and shot Joe the Masseria, and his bodyguards had stepped aside so they wouldn't get shot, and they just disappeared. Maranzano, it was very interesting. Maranzano was particularly anti-Semitic and didn't like any association with Jewish gangsters. So Luciano, ironically, arranged for four Jewish gangsters led by a man named Red Levine to go into the New York Central building where Maranzano had his office and kill Maranzano, which they did. After that, Luciano established what became the five mafia families, making himself the boss of one family. Now, over these families, which a lot of people didn't realize, was something called the National Crime Syndicate. Now, the bosses of the five families would sit on the commission of the National Crime Syndicate, but other people who were not mafia members also sat on the board of the National Crime Syndicate, people such as Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. And they actually were the overseers of organized crime, not only in New York, but throughout the entire country. And what was interesting ultimately about the Italian and Jewish gangsters as it evolved over the decades was that the Italians wanted their sons, many of them, to go into the mob. They wanted to build a dynasty. However, the Jewish gangsters primarily wanted their sons to become doctors, lawyers, accountants, etc., to go into various professions. And however, the Jewish and Italian gangsters continued to cooperate as partners well into the 1970s and perhaps even the early 1980s. And the Jewish gangsters were more involved in gambling than the Italian gangsters, and they were the ones who really developed Las Vegas. And many of the casinos, the majority of the casinos, as a matter of fact, in Las Vegas, were owned by Jewish gangsters. And amongst the mob, Las Vegas was known as Jewtown because of all the Jewish gangsters who controlled casinos there. Now, there are some interesting stories about people in the mob and myths about them. For example, there are a lot of stories that Frank Sinatra was a mob associate. and had power in the mob, which is totally untrue. He was an entertainer who associated with the mob, and I'll tell you a couple of stories about him that I thought you might find of interest. Meyer Lansky's daughter reports that while she was having dinner with her father in a restaurant in New Jersey, this was in the late 1950s when Frank Sinatra was already quite a large star. Frank Sinatra came over to their table to say hello to Meyer Lansky and accidentally turned over a pitcher of water that landed on Meyer Lansky's daughter's lap. He immediately got down on his hands and knees and grabbed several napkins and started wiping off her dress. Meyer Lansky looked at this man so sternly that his daughter said that his eyes went from gray to just little blue balls that seemed to penetrate an intense feeling of threat to Sinatra, who couldn't stop apologizing for spilling the water on Meyer Lansky's daughter. Now another interesting case happened. I was speaking to a man who was the manager of the Sands Casino, not the manager of the hotel and casino, just the casino, just the gaming room. And one night, Frank Sinatra was gambling there, and he wanted a $50,000 line of credit from the Sands, and the overall manager wouldn't give it to him. And Sinatra became furious and started yelling and screaming, and he even drove a golf cart through one of the glass windows of the Sands. And then he demanded to see the overall manager of the Sands, a man named Carl Cohen. And he met Carl Cohen in the coffee shop of the Sands and started berating him, calling him all sorts of names, and finally called Carl Cohen a dirty Jew, and Carl Cohen picked Sinatra up by his lapels and beat him up and knocked out his 4 front teeth. Sinatra was furious, obviously, as one would expect from this, and the manager of the casino drove Sinatra to a local dentist to have his lip sewn up. It was bleeding so profusely. Sinatra flew back to Los Angeles and called this man's father, who ran all the bookie joints in the Northeast, and he also called Sam Giancana in Chicago, and he demanded that Carl Cohen be killed. And they said to him, "You can't kill Carl Cohen. He's one of us. You're not one of us. He's one of us, and therefore he's protected. And also, look at who's signing your checks when you entertain at the Sands. It's Carl Cohen. You cannot touch him." I found this story absolutely fascinating. But so, how did how did the rumor develop that Frank Sinatra was an associate of mobsters? In the late 1940s, there was a conference in Havana run by Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, who returned surreptitiously from Italy to attend this conference. He had been deported to Italy by Governor Thomas Dewey after he was released from prison. And Frank Sinatra was charged with bringing $1 million to Lucky Luciano, and he was given this job by the Fischetti brothers of Chicago. And they put the $1 million in an attaché case because they felt that since Sinatra was a celebrity, no one would ask him what was in the case or ask to see what was in the case. At this conference, Sinatra was the entertainment. He was not permitted to attend any of the meetings of the mobsters, but Meyer Lansky was very grateful that he came and entertained all the mobsters there, and made him a gift of giving him the concession of the marina at one of his hotels. And part of his motive, of course, was that he could then ask Sinatra to come frequently and entertain the guests at the hotel. Another interesting fact, this is not about Sinatra, but there was a man named Lepke Buchholter who controlled all the unions in the garment center during the late 1920s, 1930s, and early 1940s. He was eventually arrested and tried by Thomas Dewey and sentenced to death. He is the only mob boss who has been executed in the United States during the 1920s. Now, a lot of people also don't realize that there are black associates of the mob, and this started in the 1930s when a black woman named Teresa St. Clair ran the numbers racket in Harlem, and she was constantly at odds with Dutch Schultz, and they were always fighting with one another. Upon her retirement, the numbers racket was taken over by a man named Bumpy Johnson, and he was followed by Leroy Nicky Barnes, who not only controlled the numbers racket, but also the distribution of hard drugs, not only in Harlem, but in many outlying areas as well. And he was an associate of Joey Gallo, also known as Crazy Joey Gallo, and he was the first person to create a formal association with black gangsters and the mafia. That has sort of died out, but it existed for almost 20 years. And Gallo was an interesting man. I have a marketing PR business as well as writing books. And one of my former clients told me an interesting story that his father owned a bowling alley in Brooklyn. And the week before the bowling alley was to open, someone came to him and said, you shouldn't be using these vending machines for cigarettes, soda, candy, etc. We can supply you much better vending machines. Well, my friend's father said, I've already accepted money from the vending machine company. I have to stay with them. And this man, the man who called upon him said, give back the money, you'll deal with us, and everything will be fine. And that man was part of the Joey Gallo crew. This bowling alley was open 24 hours a day, and late at night, a lot of mobsters would come in and bowl and drink and have a good time. So his father, in addition to having to take vending machines from Joey Gallo and his gang, also had to hire two bouncers who were members of Joey Gallo's crew. And he said of Joey Gallo that he was very polite, he was very well spoken, he was very nice, but under all of that, if you disagreed with him, you could see it in his face. There was a very obvious threat of violence. The other person I wanted to tell you about was a man named Gregory Scarpa Sr. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Mississippi Burning. It starred Gene Hackman as an FBI agent who helps to solve, excuse me, the murder of 3 Mississippi civil rights workers in the mid-1960s. Well, it's total fiction. Greg Scarpa, who is also known as the Grim Reaper for all the people he killed, was an FBI informant. And when the FBI couldn't solve the case of the 3 missing civil rights workers, they gave Greg Scarpa $100,000 to go to Mississippi and solve the case for them. He went to the primary suspect that the FBI gave him information about, who owned an appliance store, and he bought a television set from the man and had the man carry the television out to his car. When he was in the car, he put a gun to this man's head and drove him to a deserted army barracks. There he proceeded to beat up the man quite viciously, but the man would not reveal any information about the missing civil rights workers. So Gregory Scarpa took down the man's pants, pulled out a razor, and said, if you don't tell me the information I want to know, in 5 seconds, I'm going to castrate you. The man immediately revealed all the information that Greg Scarpa wanted to know. So impressed was the FBI with this that they then hired him to find out who killed a local member of the NAACP, and he was able to solve that crime as well using similar tactics. But the FBI reneged on how much money they were supposed to pay him, and he had a falling out with the FBI about that. He eventually became an informant for them again. Another interesting thing about Gregory Scarpa, he had bleeding ulcers and went into the hospital to have surgery on his ulcers. And it was during the AIDS epidemic. And he was nervous about getting any blood from the hospital and demanded that members of his crew donate blood on his behalf. Well, one of his crew members was a weightlifter who injected steroids all the time and was HIV positive. And he gave Greg Scarpa AIDS. Greg Scarpa became very, very sick. And eventually he was indicted on an illegal gun charge, even though he had thus far gotten away with the murder probably of about 80 individuals. He was confined to his home and had to wear an anklet that would reveal his whereabouts to the FBI at all times. One of his sons came home and said that he had gotten into a fight with 2 drug dealers in Brooklyn. Well, Greg Scarpa was incensed at this and said, we're going to go out and find them. And when they drove to where the drug dealers were, Greg Scarpa exchanged gunfire with them, killing one of them. And the other one shot out Greg Scarpa's right eye. Scarpa drove home with his son, bleeding profusely from his eye. As soon as he walked in the house, the phone was ringing, and it was the FBI, and they wanted to know why the anklet had gone off. And he said, well, I had to run to the pharmacy to pick up a prescription, but everything's all right. Then he proceeded to pour some Scotch whiskey into the wound of his eye, and then covered it with a towel to stop the bleeding. And his wife drove him to the hospital. He eventually died of AIDS, and it was he did win a case against the hospital. What was interesting about the doctor who he won the case against, that doctor was also charged for sodomizing 2 of his patients while they were under general anesthesia. And during the trial of Greg Scarpa suing the hospital, the judge said to the prosecutor and the defense lawyer, he said, let me get this right. We have a mob killer who's suing a doctor who sodomizes his patients. Am I on the right page? And shortly after that, Greg Scarpa died. On another area of myths in the mob, a lot of myths were, excuse me, perpetrated by the movie The Godfather. The character Sollozzo, who wanted to kill Vito Corleone, according to mob people I spoke to, they said that never would have happened. Sollozzo could have bought his own political protection. He didn't need to kill Vito Corleone in order to get mob protection. He also said that the scene where the bodyguard for Vito Corleone calls in sick so he doesn't have to protect him wouldn't have happened. He said when a mob boss has been sentenced to be killed, his bodyguard will go with him. He will never call out sick because that's a sure sign that he's in on the conspiracy to kill his boss. What he will do is he'll step aside and let the killing take place, and then either disappear or proceed to act as if he's defending his boss. This happened with the murder of Carmine Galante. It happened with the murder of Joe the Boss Masseria rather, and other mob bosses. The other thing that was a myth in The Godfather was the killing of a policeman. The mob does not kill policemen. The result of killing a policeman means that you're going to get the entire police force, the FBI, and all sorts of other agencies down on you, and you're not going to be able to do any business. So that would never happen. At one time in the early 1980s, a DEA agent named Everett Hatcher was shot in his car and killed by a low-level gangster named Constable Faraci. Well, the New York City police and the DEA and the FBI shut down every mafia business that they could get a hold of. The mob was so upset about this that they decided they would kill Faraci, and a member of the Bonanno crime family was chosen to commit this crime. And he not only killed Faraci, but the Bonanno crime family then went and told the DEA that Faraci had been killed, and everything bad that had been happening to them all of a sudden disappeared. They were able to continue operating without any problems. Of the other killing that I wanted to mention was Albert Anastasia, who was killed in the Park Sheridan Hotel. And he was killed by Joey Gallo. I wanted to mention this earlier. And he was accompanied by 4 hitmen. And he joked afterwards that they were known as the Barbershop Quintet, since they had killed Anastasia in a barbershop. And Anastasia's bodyguards were nowhere to be found when this took place. My book concludes with an account of the 2 mafia cops, Louis Eppolito and Steve Caracappa, who were hired by the mob, put on a monthly retainer, and paid for each killing that they performed. And it was estimated that they killed 10 or 12 different people before they were finally caught and executed. And finally, does the mob still operate? Yes, it does. And I spoke to a criminal defense lawyer who said that they're all terrified of the RICO statute, and which could send them to prison for 100 years. And so what they do is they consult with their lawyers about how to avoid being entrapped under the RICO statute, keeping a very low profile and still continuing to do the things that they would like to do. Anyway, that pretty much ends my talk, and I would be very happy to entertain and answer any questions that you might have. I have a question here saying, did police corruption play a significant role in the mafia's maintaining power in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s? I believe it did. From what I've been told by criminal defense lawyers and people in the mob, not all cops were bribed, but certainly there were a number who were, and it was it was easy to do that because the cops were so badly paid. For many of them, though, they drew the line about committing acts of violence or overlooking terrible crimes. Often it was for minor infractions. Excuse me. Are there any other questions? My question here is, with the FBI's primary role in fighting terrorism, do you think the mob will go back to the glory days? According to criminal defense attorneys, they have, but they're just doing it in a very quiet way that's not going to generate any problems for them. Another question is, how did organized crime bosses become romantic heroes? Well, I think that the United States has always made heroes out of villains in a way. Going back to Billy the Kid and Jesse James, we've romanticized these people because they have tremendous power, tremendous wealth, and they seem to be able to live outside of the rules and regulations that govern the way normal people live their lives. And there's kind of a Walter Mitty in all of us that would like to be able to live as these people live without the consequences of going to prison and without uh, perhaps being killed. Also, many of us are not would not like to be like to commit murders ourselves. Did anything happen to the FBI when it ran a hitman? Another person asks. Uh, yes, that FBI agent was tried. There was insufficient evidence uh, to convict him, and he retired, and he's living in Florida right now. How is Al Capone's influence in New York City back then? Al Capone participated in a number of mob conferences in New Jersey, and he originally came from Brooklyn, and he is a perfect example of the multi-ethnicity of the mob. The outfit in Chicago employed people who were Jews, who were Poles, who were Irish. It didn't matter. And when Al Capone was sent to prison for tax evasion, the outfit in Chicago was briefly run by a Jewish gangster named Jacob Greasy Thumb Guzik. He was known as Greasy Thumb because of his ability to count money very quickly with his greasy thumb. Another question is there a chance that a narco state will occur in the U.S. as exists in Mexico and Colombia, given the amount of money involved? I would assume it's entirely possible, though I'm not an authority on it, and I wish I could predict the future, but I can't. Another question is, in what areas does the mob operate now? They operate in offshore gambling, internet gambling, in real estate, in construction, and in labor, and in unions. Does the mafia still work on the waterfront in New York and New Jersey as they used to? And did former New York Governor Chris Christie's desire to shut down the Waterfront Commission possibly reinvigorate their efforts to profit from these trades? The waterfront is nothing like what it used to be. At one time, it was controlled by Albert Anastasia's brother, Tough Tony Anastasio. He spelled his last name with an O rather than an A. And they were it was run under the auspices of the Gambino family, but it's a shadow of what it had been. And the International Longshoremen's Union is actually a very good union these days. It wasn't in those days, but now it is. A question that could I comment on Fred Trump's connection with the mob since he was active in the construction industry during the 1950s? In my book, I have a chapter about Sammy Gravano, who says that regarding Donald Trump, not Fred Trump, that what the United States needs is a mobster in the White House. The country cannot be run by a civilian. A mobster is the only one who would know how to run this country. And Sammy Gravano ran an organization in New York called the Concrete Club, in which anyone who wanted to build a building that cost over $1 million had to deal with the Concrete Club, and they had to buy their concrete and deal with all the various unions, building trade unions, through the mob. And I don't know whether that still exists now that Gravano is no longer involved in that. I'm asked what the connection is between the Italian mob and the Russian and Eastern European mobsters. I'll tell you, the Russian and Eastern European mobsters are much more violent than the Italian mobsters ever were. They won't just kill an enemy, they'll kill an enemy's entire family. And they'll deal with the Italian mob if they have common business interests, but that's about it. I'm asked what was the relationship between the New York mob and the Philadelphia mob in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. The Philadelphia mob was a smaller version of the mob in New York, and actually a number of years ago in my PR marketing a business, I had an appellate lawyer as a client who represented the head of the Philadelphia mob at one time, a skinny Joey Merlino. He represented him in his appeal after he was convicted in a lower court. And they have common interests. There are mobsters in Brooklyn and mobsters in Philadelphia who have been cooperating in various enterprises together. Of all the 5 families in New York City, which was the most powerful? There were 2 that were the most powerful, the Gambinos and the Genovese families. I'm asked, does the Mafia find the anti-heroes of gangster movies as appealing as the general public does? One Mafia person I spoke to said that he thought The Godfather was a great comedy. And he found it very amusing, the way reality is twisted to make a dramatic point. So I think that they're entertained by it, but I don't know how realistic they think it is. Sammy Gravano, before he became a mobster, said that he was very attracted to the mob because of the movie The Godfather. So I guess it depends who's seeing it. Another question, a conspiracy question. Did the mob have anything to do with the assassination of JFK? Well, in the 1970s, the Senate ran the Senate investigation into the assassination of John Kennedy, and they concluded the lawyer for the committee, Robert Blakey, who created the RICO statute, believes that Jimmy Hoffa, Carlos Marcella of Louisiana, and another gangster actually arranged for the murder of JFK. They have Jimmy Hoffa, who was being prosecuted by Robert Kennedy, and Carlos Marcella on a taped conversation saying that they wanted to kill Robert Kennedy. And then the other one saying, that won't get us any place. If you want to kill a dog, you cut off its head, not its tail, the head being John F. Kennedy. And what was interesting is the man who ran all the bookies in New Orleans, for Carlos Marcella, was the uncle of Lee Harvey Oswald. But if you ever want to read the Senate investigation committee into the assassination, it's a fascinating document. It's absolutely riveting. Another question is, was the traditional mob structure and organization displaced by the emergence of other organized crime groups that don't have the same sort of restrictive protocols as the Russian crime groups, another crime? A lot of the other crime groups operate almost like pre-Arnold Rothstein gangs did in New York, and they don't have the top-down structure that the National Crime Syndicate had and enforced throughout the country. And it's really because they come from different cultural backgrounds, I think. Were there any ties between Trump and the mob? I think I answered that by quoting Sammy Gravano, saying that we need a president who's a member of the mob. The question is, did the assassination of Danny Green in Cleveland, which led to the breakup of the Cleveland Mafia, also lead to the rise of the Mafia prosecutions in New York in the 1980s and 1990s? No, it wasn't until Giuliani realized the value of the RICO statute and how that could be used. The heyday of the mob in Cleveland, by the way, was run by a group called the Mayfield Road Gang, which consisted of 4 Jewish gangsters who then went into the business of operating hotels in Las Vegas, primarily the Desert Inn. Here's another question. I attended your previous talk on mob control of boxing. Great stuff. Regarding the Anastasia rub-out, the father-in-law of a friend of mine was the barber, the only witness to the crime. He calmly took off his apron, walked out of the hotel, took a cab to Idlewild Airport, flew to his native Puerto Rico, and never returned. I think that was a very smart move on his part. Thank you for sending that question. I have another question. How was the mob eliminated from unions in New York City? I'm not so sure they were eliminated from all the unions. There are still mobsters involved in certain unions. And a lot of them are under government surveillance. And when it appears that a mobster has come out of the shadows and taken a position of prominence in a union, then they usually take the union away from them. Hold on 1 second and I'll get a copy of my book. This is the cover of my book. I hope that you can see it. It's entitled Big Apple Gangsters, The Rise and Decline of the Mob in New York. A question, suppose we encounter a suspected mob action today. Who do we call? FBI, local police, other? Well, I guess it depends on what the action is. I would probably call the FBI if I was going to call anyone. Last question, I think, is what was the association between the Irish mob and the Italian mob? The last existence of the Irish mob was the Westies, which existed on the west side of Manhattan. And it was run by a man named Jimmy Coonan. And he formed an association with the Gambino crime family after a meeting with Paul Castellano in a restaurant in Brooklyn. And they, the Westies, in effect, became hitmen for the Italian mob, very much acting the way that Murder Incorporated acted on behalf of the mob in the 1930s and early 1940s. The Westies was broken up after a man named Mickey Featherstone testified against them and went into the witness protection program. Whoever was left from the Westies wound up in prison. The question, do you think they have now expanded their operations into finance and real estate rather than traditional areas? Indeed, they have. Real estate in particular. There are a lot of buildings and developments, especially in New York, that are mob controlled. A friend of mine, her father wanted to build an office building in New York in the late 1980s, and he decided against building it because he had to deal with so many mobsters and so many tradespeople who were involved in the mob that he just felt it wasn't worth it. If there are no other questions, I just want to thank you all for coming. I enjoyed speaking with you. I hope that you enjoy my book. It's available, by the way, at Amazon.com and at BarnesandNoble.com. Again, thank you very much for attending my talk.